Before we get into it, this video, which is this session which is being recorded, plus all the prior sessions are all available either on my YouTube channel, which I encourage you to subscribe to and hit the bell icon so you get notifications, etc. This is the September 2019 version of the seminar that I do. Historically, I've covered done it as a beginner seminar. This time though, when I ran the poll, people wanted me to do buffers and layers, etc. So I'm going to spend some time talking through and doing the presentation I've done a couple of times this year already on buffers and layers. If you do want to see the beginner seminars, you will find them here. By far the most popular videos are the beginner seminars. This is the one I did back in January. Yes, it does go for over 3 hours. It's a very comprehensive walkthrough of xLights as it was back in January, which was after 3D was introduced. But obviously it doesn't cover all the latest and greatest features, but there are release update videos that come out periodically through the year that keep you up to date with all the features. So let's get into buffers and layers. So unless this is the first time you've heard someone talk about buffers and layers, you would have heard people talk about the fact that everything in xLights is a matrix, and that's true. When it comes time for the effects to render their effects onto a particular model, every single model, even something as bizarre as a moving headlight, still looks like a matrix to xLights. And that's really, really important to understand, because only by understanding the shape of the buffer that the effect is rendering on can you begin to understand exactly what the effect is doing. Now, this is why when you want to understand what an effect does, one of the best ways to do that is to drop a matrix down, create a sequence, and drop an effect on it. Because when you drop an effect on a matrix, you get to see what the effect is truly doing. So the matrix obviously has a matrix buffer, which is just a nice big rectangle, and you can see that a single strand effect is just a vertical set of lines or colors that are moving across the model. That's what the effects looks like, and the model buffer for a matrix is pretty obvious and easy. The challenge with buffers is that they're not always as straightforward as that. And so understanding how the various models come together to create those buffers, and particularly once you get into things like model groups and the like, it becomes a little bit harder to understand unless you dig into it and you work it out. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the simple ones, the default buffers and the like on each of the individual models, and then we'll loop back around and we'll cover off what model groups look like and how you can control the various flavors of buffers there. And then when we're done with all of that, we'll talk a little bit about layers. We'll focus in on the things on layers that maybe others don't cover because they don't either fully comprehend it or yeah, they just don't spend as much time on it. So let's look at our arch model here. Now, what sort of shape buffer does an arch have? Well, there's two possible ones. One that you might think about is you might think, oh, well, it's, I'm going to have this arch like this, right? And so I'm going to have a buffer, which is a nice big rectangle. Oops, I'm not real good at this thing. Which breaks the grid up like so. Right, and the vertical lines would look like this. There's a nice grid. And that would be a model buffer potentially for an arch. Now, if this was the model buffer for the arch, one of the things that you might happen, this doesn't quite show it as well as maybe I could have done it, is that, oops, is that you might get multiple nodes inside the same vertical line at the beginning of the arch where it's quite steep, and then as the arch flattens out across the top, they would be more distributed horizontally, but maybe you'd end up with multiple on the same horizontal line and then on the reverse at the other end. And so if you drop the single line effect on an arch that looks like this, you'd expect that the single line effect would move quite quickly at the beginning, because the first, when it lights up the first line of pixels here, it would light up every pixel inside that vertical line, and then it would progressively move across. So it'd start quite quickly, it'd slow down across the top, and then it'd fall quite quickly at the end. And so then if you go back to xLights, and we've already got an arch in here, and we were to take our single line effect and put it onto our arch, that's not what we see. We see that as the single line moves across the arch, it moves across the arch with consistent or unchanging linear velocity, which suggests to me that that's not actually the shape of the model buffer that's sitting behind the arch. So what sort of shape buffer would need to be sitting behind the arch for it to have constant linear velocity? Well, the most obvious, okay, that was fun. Now it's decided to draw continually. Okay, so the most obvious buffer is, of course, a nice long straight line. And so if all the nodes for the arch were distributed equally over a line, and I was to drop the single line effect on here, I would expect the model to render with consistent linear velocity. And of course, that's exactly the shape of buffer that you get on the arch model. And of course, the way to see that is to come into the node layout here and look at the node layout for the arch. And you can see that it is in fact a long line of pixels in a single line. And so that's exactly the experience that you get when you drop the single line effect on it. Now, interestingly, if you change the render style up here, because the render style here is designed to change the buffer shape and move it to per preview, you get a totally different experience. Now we're seeing what we talked about before. It starts off very quickly, it slows down across the top, and then it falls very quickly at the end and gets longer. And why is that? Well, because the original buffer that we drew, the one that the arch doesn't have, is now the buffer that the arch has. So by changing the render style up here, you're changing the shape of the buffer from this single line buffer to the big matrix that we drew earlier with the nodes distributed around it like so and broken up like that. So we get a different shape buffer for the effect to render, and so consequently the effect looks slightly different. So then you get the interesting experience of, well, what happens if I change this to be 3 arches? What's the shape of the model buffer now? Is it now a model buffer that's 1 high and 150 long, or is it slightly different? Well, let's come back up here to our effect. Let's go back to our default buffer. And we see that when we drop our single line on it, it's not acting like the buffer is a single line of 150 pixels. It's actually acting like the buffer is the first arch is a single line, but then the next one is a single line on top, and the next one is a single line on top, and so each of the pixels are laid out across this, that way, and that way, and that way. And in fact, if you come back to the Layout tab, and you right-click on the arch model and do the node layout, you'll see that that's exactly what the default node layout is. It's the 3 arches laid one on top of the other. And so consequently, when you drop the single line effect on it using the default buffer, each arch lights up at the same time and travels across at the same time. So what if that's not what you want? What if you want to have it sweep across? Well, obviously the per preview one is kind of going to work like that. But the per preview, as we showed earlier, the lights as they move across the arch accelerate as we hit the vertical parts of the arches and slow down as we hit the top of the arch. because that's the nature of the per preview. The per preview throws a grid over the top of the arches and tries to put every single pixel into its own cell on the grid. But what if you wanted constant linear velocity across the three arches? Well, then we go to our third buffer style up here, which is the single line buffer style. And what you'll find with the single line buffer style is it's actually gone and created the buffer that we originally talked about when we created three arches, which is that one long single line with 150 pixels on it, 50 pixel per arch. And now you get that constant linear velocity as the single strand effect goes across the arches. So we've gone through one model here with three different buffer shapes generating a slightly different output because we chose the different buffer shapes. Now there is one other buffer shape here, and when you're talking about a single model, this is not incredibly useful, and that's as a pixel. And what does as a pixel do? Well, as we've gone through here, we've talked about each one of these. So we said the default is for an arch is a long straight line of pixels. We talked about per preview, where the arch is laid out on a grid and all the pixels are mapped into a grid. We talked about single line, which is exactly the same as default, except if you have multiple arches, it adds them onto the end and you end up with this long single line. As a pixel, basically it has a single pixel and puts the whole arch inside the pixel. Because one of the things xLights allows is multiple nodes can actually reside inside the same cell in the grid. And when we come to the groups situation, you'll actually see that that actually becomes quite important. So as a pixel creates a 1 by 1 pixel grid, and it puts all of the pixels of the arch inside that single pixel. So what does that mean? Well, that means that the whole arch will always be a single color, i.e. it will act like an old RGB prop where there's just 3 channels. And that means if you drop something like a butterfly on it and you have it as a pixel, it's always going to be red, because with a butterfly, the bottom left-hand pixel is always red, and so the bottom left-hand pixel is the only pixel that's going to render in a butterfly on a single channel or single node model. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a feel for the arches and all of the various types of buffer shapes that exist. And as you go through the other models, you're going to find that most of the models have exactly the same thing. In fact, let's go back to our matrix, because our matrix has exactly the same sort of situation. If you start with default, we saw default where it's a grid. The grid is the number of rows high and the number of columns wide, and that's what it does. If you go to per preview, it's going to be exactly the same. There is absolutely no difference with a matrix between default and per preview, exactly the same. What happens if you do single line? Well, single line is going to somehow take this matrix and stretch it all out into a 1 pixel high matrix, but as long as there are pixels. So this is a 50 by 16, so that's going to be an 800, so a 1 high by 800 long render buffer. And so consequently, the single line now moves across the strands. And you'll notice that, and this is regardless of the zigzagging, it takes the bottom line, because this starts at the bottom left. It takes the bottom line and then it takes the second line and adds it onto the end. So our model buffer shape here is like this one here, where this is the first line, the first strand at the bottom. This is the second strand. This is the third strand, and so on. And that's what that single strand does, or the single line does. And then as a pixel does exactly as you would expect it to do, it just does the whole model as a single pixel. So every single one of these 800 nodes has been mapped into that single 1 by 1 grid. And so therefore every pixel on the model is exactly the same color. Now that kind of seems kind of useless at this point, and it is. There's really not a lot of point to it at this. But once you get into the model groups, etc., you can begin to see where as a pixel becomes somewhat useful in certain situations. Now, most of the other models are, to be honest, just a repeat of this. Most of the other models have exactly the same styles of buffers. There are a couple of exceptions or some oddities. So one oddity is the candy canes. And in fact, the candy canes and arches are both oddities. Many people would have told you, let's draw a tree here. Let's change this to 4 strings of 200 with 4 strands per string. So many people would have told you that if you go into the node layout, you can see via the colors here that there's 4 strings here, that this uses 4 controller ports if you had the controller ports set up. And that's all true. That's exactly how that one's set up. Curiously, and this is not going to change anytime soon, but curiously the node layout here tells you that that these arches are actually 4 strings, and that's incorrect. These are actually all considered a single string, and in fact, if I set the controller connection down here and put these arches on output 1, you'll notice that it's only using controller connection 1. It's not actually using 3 controller connections, even though it tells you here that there are 3 strings. That's not actually true. The same's true with the candy canes. If I go to the candy canes and put them on port 2, and I come up to node layout for the candy canes, you'll notice that although it shows them as being 3 separate strings, they're actually all on a single output port. And you'll notice that the candy cane default model has nothing to do with the shape of the actual candy cane itself. Every cane is just a vertical line of pixels. And that creates interesting and useful outcomes. So why is that important? Well, it's important because when we throw a single line on it, because that buffer has all of the pixels organized in vertical lines, it means our single strand effect lights up each cane individually and in its entirety. Whereas if you had the per preview buffer, you can see that the single strand effect actually lights up the hook as if the pixels are separately laid out. And that's why we chose a default buffer for the candy canes, which has everything in a vertical line, because it's useful and different from the per preview. We're always going to get the per preview, so you want to make the default buffer something that's useful for the user to use. So that's the candy cane. Some of the models do have slightly unusual buffers. So the star, if you define layers on your star, so let's make this a 40, 30, 20 star. By default, the node layout of the star is actually like the per preview. So here's a classic example of how the pixels are laid out on a sparsely populated grid. Now, this is the buffer that's going to get presented to the effect. So obviously, when you use this sort of buffer on the effect and you start to render and you do the single strand, it's actually going to draw in all of these cells, even if there's no pixel there. And this is actually very common. This is exactly how xLights works. The buffer is presented to the effect. The effect has no idea where the pixels actually are on the buffer. It just has a buffer that in this case is 41 high by, and it doesn't say how wide it is, but so basically it gets presented with a buffer that looks like this, and it just starts drawing in all of these cells. It's only when it gets time to actually do the layer blending and everything else that it actually starts to look at, well, where actually are the pixels and how many pixels are in each one of these cells. So the effect doesn't actually understand what the model looks like. So now when you go in and you drop your single strand effect down onto that model, of course, it draws across the model like a per preview. And in fact, if you change the layout here to per preview, there's no difference.
the buffer is exactly the same shape. If you get to a single line, of course, now it starts to look slightly differently. Now what it's done is it's taken the outer layer. All right, so what it's done with the star is it's put the outer part of the star here, then it's taken the middle layer of the star and then the center layer of the star, and it's put it out like that. And that's why you get that effect on when you set this to single line. Notice how there's also a layer star here as well, though. And the layer star creates a slightly different shape buffer. And if you think very hard about this, what you'll actually find is this is creating quite an interesting buffer shape. What it's doing is it's taking the first layer, right, which has 40 pixels on it, and laying it all out like that. It's then taking another layer here, and what it's doing is it's laying out 30 pixels. So those 30 pixels are not going to be, obviously it's not 40, so there's going to be some gaps in here. So you're going to get the odd cell here that has no pixel in it. But if you look very carefully at the way the star renders, notice how it starts and stops each of those strands at basically the same time. So what that means is pixel 1 on this layer and pixel 1 on this layer here, pixel 40 is on the layer here and pixel 30 is on the layer here, and they're in the same cell. So there must be some gaps in this layer here. And of course, once you get to the 20 layer, it's worse, right? So with the 20 layer, pixel 1's here and pixel 1's here. So basically every second cell is blank, and so on across the thing. And then the single strand effect is rendering across this. So again, the effect doesn't understand that. It still renders in this cell, even though there's no pixel inside here, it will still render in that cell, it'll draw it red or whatever. But when it comes time for xLights to map it to the pixel, there's no pixel there, so it doesn't get mapped to any of the outputs. So yeah, that's the layered star. Sorry. Okay, now my mouse is choosing to play up on me. All right, so that's the layered star buffer. The spinner model also has a slightly interesting model node layout. Here, the node layout is such that, and it's a little bit hard to tell, if I'd made this a little bit longer, it might have been more obvious. But what it's done here is it's taken each of the arms and drawn them as a vertical line in the matrix. Again, nothing like the actual layout of the pixels on the model, but a really usefully shaped buffer when it comes time to sequence. Because when you throw your single strand effect down onto your spinner model, what it does is it spins around the model. Because that buffer has every node for each of the arms orientated vertically. It also means that if I was to rotate this buffer slightly by 90 degrees, now the single strand effect comes in along each arm. We'll come back to rotation in a minute. Obviously, if I go back to per preview, now it's drawing across it mapped out with a grid overlay, just as we showed earlier. The single line, now it's once again, it's taken each arm and laid each arm out in order on a long single line. So again, the buffer layout shapes on a spinner are very useful for generating different types of effects. So the only other ones here that are quite interesting are custom and the cube model. Now I know not many people use the cube model, but let's go there next. The cube model doesn't look too great in 2D, but in 3D, obviously, the cube model is much more interesting, but we're going to stay in 2D for the moment. When you sequence on a cube, you actually end up with a huge number of different buffer shapes that you can play with. Let's get our single strand again. Where's our single strand gone? Oh, there it is. And throw it onto the cube. I am going to put this into 3D because it's actually really hard to see what's happening without it. Go back here. Let's bring up our node layout.
So our node layout for a cube is quite interesting because obviously all buffers and all effects render on 2D buffers in xLights. So consequently, the cube has been flattened out into a grid. Now this is a 5 by 5 cube, and so what you see is that the front face, so this face, the front face here, if you're looking in the first set of 25 pixels that you can see here, they've been laid out as the first one here. And then the next one, the next layer of pixels in here, they've been laid out in another 25 grid, and so on back to the back of the model. So over the right-hand side here is the back face of the model. So when we go back to our sequencer, and we look at our single line, but you can see that it is going through the faces of the model. But the cube has a whole bunch of different pieces. You can do per preview, and here it's starting at the left-hand side. Unfortunately, I don't have my wheel mouse here, so let's make this easy on ourselves. Let's put it in the middle. So now we can bring this around. Oops, didn't mean to do that. So now you can see that it's actually starting at the left and then moving through the layers, as you would expect, because the camera by default is looking at the front of the model. You'll notice that there is spaces in this buffer as well. This buffer is actually not necessarily as compressed as maybe it should be. Single line, it's obviously going to run through the pixels. But then you have these various different buffers. So this is stacked X horizontally, so it's taken, basically it's looking at the cube. If I draw that, what it's done is it's taken the cube. Right, so there's our cube. Now, this is the X-axis. This is the Y-axis. And in fact, whenever you look at the Y-axis, although it actually starts always at the top, and the reason for that is, I guess I always assumed that people would look at a cube more down at the cube rather than up at the cube, and so it made sense that the Y-axis would work that way. And then you've got the Z-axis, and the Z-axis is here. So in this particular render buffer that we're talking about stacked text horizontally. So what that means is taking the X-axis, this face here, the face that you can't see here, the one looking in this way, that will become the first set of pixels in your buffer. And then the next layer, as you go back, will go there. And then the next layer will go there. And the next layer will go there. And so if you look at the rendering, that's what it's doing. Okay, not only that, but these pixels back here are going to be the first pixels here in the buffer, and that's how it's rendering. If we do stacked Y horizontally, notice it started rendering at the top of the model and it's rendering down. Why? Well, because the Y-axis is the axis through the middle here. So what it's done is it's looking down, it's taken this face here, and it's put that as the first face up here. And then it's gone to the next layer down in the model, and that's become this one. Then it's taken this one, that's become this one, and so on down. And so the render of the single line, it started at the top of the model and it's moved progressively down through them. Stacked Z horizontally. Has basically taken the Z-axis, so that means that the first face is the front here, and that's become this buffer here. The next one's taken this buffer, and so on back through the layers. And that's meant to be the default. You then have vertically stacking. What does that mean? Well, basically, it's the same sort of concept, except what it's done is it's stacked the buffers up vertically. So stacked X vertically, again, is going to start here. So the first buffer is going to be this one here, and that's going to become this one, and so on back, right? Because we're going through the X-axis, and because they're stacked vertically, they're stacked like this. So the single strand effect, in theory, should light up all of these pixels across the back here first, and then so on. And that's what it's doing. Starts at the back, and it lights up each layer as it comes forward. Stacked Y vertically, you'd do the same thing, except this time it would take this top layer here, and that would become this layer. Then the next layer down here would become this layer. So if we make this stacked Y vertically, now because it's stacking Y vertically, what it's effectively going to say is this line of pixels here are going to be this line here. The pixels that are in the second layer here are going to be these ones, and so on down. And so once again, you'll get a vertical line. Won't look that interesting. And then stacked Z vertically does the same thing, except this time it's going to take all of these pixels here, and it's going to take these pixels here, and they're going to be number one. And then the next ones back here are going to be these ones, and so on back. And it's going to produce a very similar result. You then get to the overlays. Now the overlays are basically, in this case, they're not going to generate anything particularly interesting or useful. But what this does is, instead of stacking it, so you've noticed we've talked about stacked horizontally, we've talked about stacked vertically. Well, overlay is basically going to take all of those layers and put them into a similar grid. So the buffer that gets presented to the effect to render, in this case, because it's a 5 by 5 by 5 grid, is going to be a 5 by 5 grid. And all of the pixels, now again, you need to think about which axis. So if we're doing the Z axis, then this pixel, this pixel, this pixel, this pixel, this pixel are all going to be mapped into that first square. This pixel here and so on back through there are all going to be mapped into the second pixel here, and so on. And so the overlay concept is one where everything is overlaid. So instead of ending up in this case with a 25 by 5 grid, or in this case oops, apparently I drew on the title bar, a 25 by 5 grid, you end up with this 5 by 5 grid. So that's the overlays. The unique X and Y, these ones here. So what this is saying is I want every XY coordinate to be unique. And so in order to do that, right, what you don't want is any pixel to share an X or a Y coordinate. So for the first layer, it's pretty easy. All of these things are good. So this is layer 1. But if I can't put it here because I put the next buffer here, they'll all share an X coordinate. So we don't want to do that. So what it does is it actually lays out a buffer that looks like this. So it's 25 wide by 25 high. Every single pixel in it has got a unique address where the X and the Y coordinate are different. And that's the sort of buffer that this unique X and Y. Now notice it says unique X and Y X. Well, what that means is we're looking at it from the X side, along the X axis. So this particular layer, the first layer here, is going to be this one. The next layer on the X one is going to be this one, and so on. Right, all the way back. The various other ones basically give you that unique X and Y, but use the different axes for you to move between. And then you get these left, right, top, bottom, etc. And these are interesting because this is the first time we've come across a buffer where not every pixel is actually mapped to the buffer. So take the front side. So here's the front. These first 25 pixels on the cube are the front side. So what it does is it creates a buffer that is 5 by 5. It takes all of the front 25 pixels here and it maps them into the grid. And then it just doesn't bother mapping any of the others. And so we end up with this grid that is 5 by 5 that only contains 25 pixels. And so when it transfers the data onto the pixels, whatever is put onto that particular buffer only lights up those front pixels. So if you wanted a cube and you wanted to put a different image or a different pattern on every face of the cube, you could use these render buffer styles here and that's what that would do. It would just put the effect onto that particular face of the cube. So it's a huge array of different buffer styles that 3D starts to make possible. All right, so before we get to model groups, there's one other that I wanted to touch on, and that's the custom model. So let's go and create a custom model. I'm really lazy when it comes to my custom models. 6, 7. All right, let's give it some depth. I'm just going to put 1 pixel on this layer. All right. So now we've got a 3D custom model with an extra pixel on a separate layer. Let's go and create our new sequence again. Let's grab our single line effect. Throw it down in our custom model. And let's look at our buffer layouts. So here you'll notice that the custom model, and this happens because the custom model is a 3D custom model, you do get all of those similar sorts of 3D type buffers. You don't get the faces, and the faces didn't make as much sense with a custom model because there's not really faces, unlike a cube. But all of the overlaid and stacked ones are all here for you to take advantage of with your custom models as well. So I think, from memory, I don't think any of the other models, I mean the window frame model, let's get out of 3D. The window frame model has got an interesting node layout. You might think that it would be a single strand, but it's not. It actually does create a window frame layout that actually draws the pixels out around the edge. That obviously means that when it comes time to sequence a window frame, you need to choose your effects quite carefully. Because when I throw my single strand down onto my window frame, it's going to draw it like a per preview. If you really wanted that single strand to run around the window frame, you are going to need to use a single line buffer layout in order to get the effect that you might be after. But the beauty of the window frame being drawn that way means that if you did choose to throw a marquee down, the marquee is going to produce the result you would expect because it does draw it around the outside. I don't think any of the others offer anything that's interesting. The polyline just draws a straight line, just like the single line does. The icicles does draw a okay. Sorry. I think that was me, yeah. So the icicles does draw an interesting shape buffer. What it does is it distributes those nodes out across a matrix where the vertical lines are the drops on the icicles. So obviously if you drop that single strand onto this buffer here, it's going to light up the strands of the icicles, which is probably exactly what you'd expect it to do. The image model creates a buffer that's 1 by 1 because you can only ever have a single channel for an image model. Whereas the DMX model, not that people would generally use the DMX model as effects, but what that does is if you've created a DMX model with 5 channels, it's going to create basically a 5 by 1 buffer. Not that it's particularly useful. Most people would use the DMX effect because the DMX effect, unlike all of the others, the DMX effect actually addresses the individual channels. And in fact, if you use the DMX model, you really want to be using things like the on, the color wash, and the DMX effect, because those effects are the only effects that are really understand the DMX model and understand how to address the various channels, particularly when the color channels are specific channels within the model that you need to be setting, and these effects are the only ones that know how to work with those channels. And I think that's it. So then it all gets very interesting when you throw everything into a group. So if we grab all of this stuff, let's grab all but that thing that we, let's create a group. Spells it very badly, it doesn't matter. Okay. So we've gone and created a group and we've put all of our models into the group. The first thing that I will call out is the order of the models in the group matters. The way in which the buffer is constructed for this group when we get into some of the buffer shapes is very dependent upon the order that things appear in here, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. The second thing to understand about a model group is the model group default buffer shape, which you can't actually just view here by doing the node layout, is the same as the per preview for other models. What it's going to do is it's going to overlay on top of all of these models an imaginary grid, and it's basically going to attempt to put every pixel into its own cell across that grid. Now, that becomes quite challenging if you've got a very, very big display or a lot of density on your models. So then the question becomes is, well, just how big can that grid be? Because obviously the bigger the grid is, the bigger the buffer is. The bigger the buffer is, the more work that the effect has to do to fill the buffer up, and the more work that xLights has to do. And the answer is actually this setting here that people generally don't pay a great deal of attention to, which is this maximum grid size. And what that's saying is that when I take all of my models, my star and my matrix and everything else, and I throw this grid across the top of it, and I draw all those lines to try and get all my pixels into their individual cells, what it's saying is that this here cannot be any more than 400, and this here cannot be any more than 400. If it finds that it needs more than 400 cells here to try and get all the pixels into their own cell, what it does is it caps it at 400, and any pixels that were really, really close together, you might get one cell here that has several pixels inside it, and that's okay. So you get to control that. If you set that really small, it creates interesting things. So let's go and create another group with exactly the same models in it. Create group. Let's call this course. And what I'm going to do, and I think the minimum of this is 10. Let's create another group where it's 10. Discard changes, done. And let's go and grab our single strand again, and let's throw it down first of all on our group. And when we throw it down on our group, we get exactly what you'd expect it to get. It has that overlay, and the single strand moves across all the models in place. This is your whole house effect. This is why people, want to use advanced sequences, because this is what it gives you. But if we move this down onto our course one, see what happens. It doesn't look anything like the other group, yet it is in a group of exactly the same models in exactly the same order and everything else, but it looks quite different. And why does it look quite different? Well, it looks quite different because this 400 is no longer 400. This 400 is now 10, and this 400 is now 10. And what that means is that because it's only a grid of 10 long, well, there's a whole bunch of pixels that sit inside each cell. And so it's basically broken this thing up into 10. And in fact, if you're careful and you count it, you'll actually count that there are 10 cells. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Right? And if I was to move this so it came down from the top to the bottom, the same thing would be true. There would be 10 cells starting at the top, going down to the bottom. So you actually control the buffer shape, or in this case, the coarsity of the buffer. Now, why would you want to do that? I don't know, early in the season, your sequences will render a lot faster if you reduce that number. Obviously, your effects won't look the same. It's also the reason why, let's do this, actually. Let's do this. Let's go. Let's zoom crazy out. And let's grab an arch, and we're going to put an arch over here. And I'm going to come to, not the coarse group, I'm going to come to the regular group, and I'm going to throw that arch into the group and save. Let's go back to the sequencer. Let's go back up. Let's move our effects back up onto the group here. Now, first of all, you'll notice how all the models they basically almost light up simultaneously. And the reason for that is because it's now had to throw that grid. And although the grid's still 400 by 400, it is so spread out now that it's actually finding that it's very hard for it to fit all of the pixels in to individual cells. And so everything's starting to end up in the same cell at the same time. The other thing you'll notice here is that all of that black space in the middle has actually appearing inside the buffer. So when you look at your layout here, I have the arch all the way over here, and then I have a whole bunch of models over here, and I have a whole bunch of black space here. Well, it doesn't just do a bunch of cells here and do a bunch of cells over here and just leave all of this out. It fills it all in. These things are all equally sized, and so I get this big black area in the middle of my buffer with my pixels over here and my pixels over here and a lot of blackness in the middle. And the per preview will always do that. That's exactly what it does. Okay, let's go over there and delete that because that's not useful. We'll reset our display. The other thing that you can do here is, and this will show up a little bit more. Let's move all the models a little bit over to the left. Save that. Let's go back and quickly look at our sequencer. So notice that, shorten this up a little, so that goes through a little bit quicker. So notice how that when it gets to the end of rendering the model, it basically immediately restarts on the right-hand side and sequences across. The reason that that happens is that when it is drawing this grid around all of the models, it ensures that the left edge here, that the first pixel from the first model appears in this first column. It also ensures that the last model on the right-hand side here, the last pixel appears in this column, and same with the bottom and the top. And this is what's known as a minimal grid, i.e. a grid that can be minimally drawn around the models that happen to be in the group. But you can change that. We can actually come back to our group here, and instead of choosing minimal grid, we can say grid as per preview. And what that's going to do is it's going to overlay the grid using the default preview. Now, this is one of the few situations where drawing the 2D bounding box becomes useful because it gives you a feeling for what the per preview area is. And so now when I click on this effect and render it, you'll notice that there's a whole bunch of black time, and then it renders across the model, then you get nothing's on at all. And the reason for that is that you've now got this buffer with all of my models over here on the right-hand side. All of this area here is blackness, but because I didn't say minimal grid, if I said minimal grid, it would have drawn a box like this. But because I said grid per preview, it drew a box like this. And when it broke it all up into cells in order to fit everything into its individual boxes, it ends up with a whole bunch of blackness over here. And so my single strand effect now renders into that blackness. So that's what that minimal grid versus, sorry, change back to minimal grid. That's what grid per preview versus minimal grid will do. Notice you can also set a whole bunch of other different buffer styles here, but we'll go back to minimal grid again because that's how most people do it. And people very rarely change this. So, all right, let's go back. So we're back on our grid here, back on our group here and our single strand effect. And if we come up to our render styles, we see that there are a huge number of different buffer shapes that we can start to take advantage of with our model groups. And it's why you may choose to create, this is why we create groups in the first place. So the default and the per preview are exactly the same. There is literally no difference. The single line, so what's the single line going to do? Well, the single line is going to create an insanely big line. What it's going to do is, in this case, it's going to take our arches and it's going to create a buffer which is long like that, and it's going to put our arches in here. All right, this is 1 high and our arches are 50 long, so it's going to put an arch buffer like that. The next model is our candy canes. Now remember, our candy cane buffer is 3 vertical lines, but what it's going to do is it's going to take our first candy cane and it's going to put it there, and then our second candy cane, and then our third candy cane. It's then going to take our cube, so our cubes, it's going to break it all up into all of its layers and lines, etc., and it's going to put them all out, and it's basically going to create a buffer here that is as long as there are pixels in all of these models, and it's going to do them in the order that they appear in this list here. 1 high by God knows how many long. So it's going to create a very, very long buffer. And so when you look at the effects that are generating, you can see that, you know, as it goes through the matrix, it's lighting up each strand and it's going around each model in turn. So that's the single line. As a pixel gets more interesting. So as a pixel at this level does the whole group as a single pixel. So every model is going to be exactly the same color in the group. But we will come to as a pixel down here where it gets much more interesting. Horizontally stacked buffers. Now this is interesting. There's actually a really specific purpose for this. Horizontally stacked buffers is going to do some interesting things. So the first thing it's going to do is it's obviously going to stack them out horizontally. So across the page are going to be all the model buffers. But what it's doing is it's taking each of the model default buffers. So our arch was first, so it's going to take our very poorly drawn single line and it's going to lay it out like that. It's then going to get to our candy canes. Well, our candy canes are like this, remember? So basically this is 50, this is 3 here. So it's going to lay it out like that. But instead of being 1 high, this is, I don't know, I think it's 18 high. So it's going to add them up. Now these ones here are all going to line up with these ones here because it's all the models are going to be lined up at the bottom. I don't remember what model's next. So our cube model's next. So it's going to take our default cube buffer, which is, you know, the face, the second layer, third layer, etc. It's going to lay them all out like that. Then it's going to take our icicles. Now remember, our icicles have got a very funky buffer where, you know, it's actually aligned up at the top, right? So you end up with these gaps down here, but that's okay. That's the default buffer, so it's going to lay that out. Then it's going to take our matrix, all of its pixels. That's 16 high though, so this is probably only 5 high, so ignore that. It goes a little bit higher. And then our spinner buffer, which was our vertical lines of our spinners and so forth. And that's the shape of the buffer that it's going to create for horizontally single stacked. Now, this is really important when it comes to matrices. Some people have done this, right? They've got, I've commonly seen it with something like, you know, they've got columns on the front of their house and they put a matrix onto the front here and they put a matrix onto the front here, and they want to put text that scrolls across the two things. And so they do this and then they put them into a group and they go and try and put the text on it, and they find that the text doesn't quite line up, it doesn't look right, and so forth. And the reason is because when you're using per preview, it's just overlaying this grid on it, and unless everything here is 100% perfectly lined up, you're not going to get a model buffer where all of the bottom pixels on here exactly line up with the bottom pixels over here. There'll be 1 or 2 out and it'll be really messy. But if you use the horizontally stacked buffer, it's going to basically put that grid there that grid there. It's going to guarantee that they line up. So the first line down here will be the same as the first line here. And so when you throw the text effect onto this model buffer, the text is going to look perfect across the two models. And that's why you would use horizontally stacked. Now, vertically stacked is exactly the same, except in this case, our arches are going to be here, our candy canes are going to be here. I don't remember. Our matrix is going to be here, and our cube's going to be laid out here, and so forth. Right? And that's going to be the model buffer. And so when the single strand comes on, it's going to light up this section first and then move its way across the buffer. And that's our vertical stack. Right? Every model from left to right. Horizontal per model. So what this is doing, from memory is it's laying the models out, but what it's doing is it's putting our arches in here, it's putting our candy canes in here, it's putting our cube in here, our matrix in here, and so forth, right? But each one of these is one node, so the whole thing sits inside a single cell. Let's talk about the overlays. So the overlays are similar, except what it's doing here is it's taking these buffers and basically overlaying the buffers on top of each other. Right, so our candy canes are going to be like this, our arches, our matrix, and so forth. Right, everything gets overlaid. Now, there's overlaid, centered, and scaled. And with scaled, all it's doing is making sure that every buffer is basically the same size. This shows up a lot better if you've got a bunch of stars or snowflakes, etc., and they're slightly different sizes. And you create a group of them, and you want to put the same effect or something on it. That's the sort of model buffer that an overlay scaled is going to give you. So overlay centers just centers them, but scaling actually makes sure that they're all the same size. Single line model as a pixel. So single line model as a pixel is actually much more like this, where every model is in its as a pixel. So as a pixel means that the whole model is inside a single box, and it creates a single line, which means it jams them all hard up against one another. The reason that makes a difference is because there's default model as a pixel. And what this does is, instead of here obviously everything's jammed up, but what this does is it actually respects their spacing. And so you might get the arch here, but then there might be a gap to the candy canes. The candy canes might be hard up against this, etc., or potentially another model's directly underneath it. And so those will all appear inside a single cell. And so it's still always going to light up every pixel inside each model as a single thing, but they're laid out across space and respect their location on the display. So it's almost like probably a better way to explain this. Some of these things are quite difficult. So it's almost like, so if this is my arch and this is my candy canes and this is my matrix, etc., star, etc., what it's done is it's taken all of this arch and it's shrunk it down to be a single pixel. And it's taken these candy canes and it's shrunk that down to be a single pixel. The stars become a single pixel, and the matrix has become a single pixel. It's then gone and done the minimal grid thing, and it's broken it up into a small grid like so. And obviously when the arch lights up, it's all going to light up the same color, but it respects its location on the preview. That's probably a better way of explaining it. Whereas with the previous one, it lined them all up in a single line. Then you get the per model default, per model, per preview, per model single line. And these things are really just your productivity aids. What these things say is, I want to apply the same effect to all of the models, but as if I had dropped it onto each of the individual models. So let's do per model default. So what this is like, it's as if I'd gone and grabbed this single strand effect and copied and pasted it down onto all of the models down here and used the default layout. That's what that one's done. So it's kind of a shortcut for doing a whole bunch of additional sequencing, gets rid of a whole bunch of effects. And you have per model default, per model per preview, which obviously respects the location of the model, and then per model single line. But every model, it's like I said, it's like the effect has been dropped on the individual model. There is nothing that takes into account the relative locations of the models on the display. Basically, it's as if, you know, my star has its buffer created, whichever the buffer is, whether it's default or per preview, and then the single strand is rendered on it. At the same time, the arch model, which has its buffer, it's being rendered onto the candy cane buffer, which is our 3 vertical lines. It's had that same effect applied to it. And these things are totally unrelated. They're not related in space or anything else. It's just rendering on that default buffer or that per preview buffer. So they're all the buffer shapes and what they mean. And I kind of glossed over some in the middle here because these, I never use them, and I kind of have to play with them to try and understand exactly what they're doing, and I got a little bit lost there. But generally speaking, the most common ones that you're going to use are these other ones. Now, you obviously can also apply transformations to the buffers. And all this is doing, and it's actually important with something like a single strand. Let's go and put our single strand back on our spinners, because this is where it's useful. Let's go back to default. So all this is doing is allowing you to basically either flip or rotate the buffer. It doesn't change the buffer shape at all. So in the case of a spinner, remember our spinner buffer was, each arm was a vertical line in here. All it's doing is, instead of the vertical line starting here and going up to here, if I rotate this 90 degrees, all it's going to do is take this pixel here and put it here, and the spinner's going to go this way. And this is going to be the buffer that's presented to the effect to render. So in the case of the single strand which starts here and renders across here, each arm in turn is going to light up. If I rotate it this way, then basically the end of the spinner is going to light up, and it's going to basically progress down the arm of the spinner. And if I want it to progress the other way, I just rotate the buffer the other way. When I rotate the buffer the other way, this pixel here becomes this pixel over here. Yeah, so rotate it that way, and so forth, right? And so you end up with a reverse buffer. So that's what the transformations of the buffers do. So yeah, in this case here, we rotate it counterclockwise. It's going to come from the outside in. And if we rotate it clockwise, it goes from the inside out, right? So this one here, that was rotating it clockwise, so inside out. This is rotating it counterclockwise, so the end's going to be here, the beginning's going to be here. So when it renders, it's going to go from the outside towards the center of the spinner.
It says, does the randomize effects also randomize the buffers?
Oh, I don't actually know. But hell, that can't be hard to work out, can it? Let's have a look. What do we get? Default. 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 I'm guessing not at this pace. I think that's a statistically significant sample, and it hasn't. In fact, not only that, but it actually kept the rotate clockwise, which I'd previously had set. So I think it's a fair bet that No, it does not. It just randomizes the effect settings down here.
I think it just does the colors and the effect settings.
Yeah. Let's move on to our blend styles then. And here we'll use a matrix because it's always easier to do these things on a matrix. Red, green, blue, let's get rid of those. Let's add black and white. Okay, so layer blending is obviously, and thanks to Scott, there's a nice dialogue. Which pops up, God knows where. Where's it pop up, Scott?
It actually opens Notepad.
Oh, sorry, it does too. Oh, that's what it is. I've opened 3 notepads. Okay. So it's given me this long list of blend styles that I can apply onto my various models. And let's go through some of them and give you, so you can get a feeling for what each one of them does. So let's actually let's throw another bars effect down underneath this one. Same colors, but I'm going to make that go to the right. All right. So at the moment, because layers always render from bottom to top, we're only seeing the model on the top. And in fact, if we come to this effect 1, you'll notice that nothing changes. The effect 1 kind of dates back to version 3 of xLights, where you used to only have 2 layers and you could choose effect 1 or effect 2 or blend the 2 together. Effect 1 basically just selects the top effect. If I select effect 2, it would help if I was on effect 1, because layer blending only works from the top down. So effect 1 shows effect 1. Effect 2 basically says to effect 1, don't do anything, let effect 2 show through. And I have to set that back to normal because it was trying to let through something underneath. Okay, so effect 1 here is saying show effect 2, and so effect 1 doesn't show at all, and only effect 2 shows up. Not incredibly useful. There are a couple of times where sometimes it's nice to be able to just block out all the effects underneath and see what's going on, or block out the effects above and just show what's going on underneath. But generally speaking, you would not expect people to be using much of this inside shows. There are a couple of situations where you might want to do this when it comes to some of the more complicated skipping of layers and merging of layers and canvas effects and the like. But for the most part, you're never going to use these. Let's talk about one is a mask. So what this is saying is that one is a mask. So what is one doing? Does everyone remember what one is doing? Well, one is our horizontal bars. Let's get rid of our single strand up here. So one is our, oh, of course I've gone and I've set it as a mask. So one is not going to show at all. What one is going to do is act as a mask where it's black. So basically wherever the black bar is in the top model is going to basically show out what's underneath. So what's underneath is these horizontal bars, and because we only have one black stripe in the top one, you're only seeing that gap in the top one. So anywhere in this particular effect which is not black is going to mask out anything that's underneath it, and so only the stuff where it's black is going to show through. And so that's what we're getting. And obviously then if one is an unmask, you would expect everything to show through, except you get this weird behavior where the underlying effect is white, sorry, is black, it comes up as white. And that's a really weird thing to have happen. And that's why there is one is a true unmask. where the black actually stays black underneath, and that's the difference between the true unmask and the not. Now, where you've got the 2 and the 1, 2 always refers to the sum of all the layers underneath. Now, how this applies, and this is kind of important to understand if you're going to start producing lots and lots of layers. If you've got multiple layers here of effects, the way the rendering works is, and we'll ignore canvas mode for a minute, is every effect actually renders independently with no awareness of what's above or below it. And so it renders whatever that effect is, vertical bars, horizontal bars, etc., etc. And then at the very end of the process, we start to go through a layer blending process. And so what that does is it takes the data from here and the data from here, and it applies the blend style to produce a new layer with that blending applied, whatever that blending happens to be. It then takes the output of this buffer, and it takes the buffer above, and it applies the next blend style to it. Now, the blend style is always the blend style on the layer above. The blend style on the bottom layer is basically blending with an imaginary black layer. Okay, and it is black. So if you're using a style that doesn't blend together well with black, you're going to end up with issues. But this blend style controls this blend event. This blend style controls this blend event. And then so this last layer up here, basically this thing's going to blend together and produce another one, and then that's going to merge together with this one using the blend style that's applied on this layer, and that's what produces my final output that you get to see on the pixels. Okay, so in this case, what's happened is we've had our horizontal lines, we've got our top lines. One is a true unmask. What that means is anywhere where the top layer is any color other than black, show through the color underneath. And so you see the true colors showing through, and where there was blackness, there was that 1 bar of blackness in the top layer, it's basically eliminated that from the display. So that's the difference between unmask and mask, basically. Now, the 2s basically reverse the thing. So what that means is it's almost as if, so if this was, so how do I best describe this? So basically, if with this is, I don't know, 1 is mask, right? It behaves like that. If I set this to 2 is mask, 2 is mask, right? And I've got my 2 layers. It's like 1 is mask where these 2 layers have been swapped over, where basically this layer here is now acting like the mask on this layer, and so we now get to see the content. So here, this thing here doesn't actually draw anything, but it just shows through this particular effect here after applying the mask. Well, in this case here, it's this effect that doesn't draw anything. This is the effect that's doing the drawing, but this thing is now unmasking this or masking this in a way that shows through whatever the content of this effect were. And so that's the difference between the 1 and 2s. It just controls whether one effect or the, sorry, damn it, plays up. It's just controlling which one is being the mask or the unmasked. So you get all of these ones which are 1 and 2, and it just controls that. Generally speaking, I stick to 1. There's a couple of situations where the 2 is actually useful to use, but they're not common. So 1 is mask, 1 is unmask, and 1 is true unmask. Remember, 1 is unmask has the problem that it takes anything that's black and makes it white, which is just a bit weird in my view. 1 reveals 2 is actually the default. Well, actually no, it's almost the default. The difference is when 1 reveals 2, anywhere that's black in the top model, the bottom model shows through. And so what you're seeing here is that black bar in the top bars is letting through a view of the vertical bars in the lower layer. In the case of the normal, it was actually the black is overwriting the underneath one, and so you can't actually see. Now this is done inconsistently in xLights. Some models draw the black and some models don't draw the black. Where they don't draw the black, the bottom would show through. Where they do draw the black, then obviously the bottom is not showing through. In the case of the bars, if you selected black up here, it does draw the black, and so it doesn't show through anything from the underlying layers on normal. Shadow 1 on 2. So this is a color blend, and from memory, yeah, this is producing some somewhat interesting results, right? Because notice the white and the black are not changing at all in the vertical bars, but the horizontal bars, and it may be a little bit hard to tell on the video, but the red, green, and blue are actually changing color, affected by the layers underneath, but the black and the white are not. So an interesting blend style, not one that I use very often. Layered, and I think layered you'll find layered is almost the reverse of 1 reveals 2. In this case, 2 reveals 1 and layered are basically the same thing, doing the same thing. Average is interesting. So average is basically applying the color from each pixel and then averaging out on each channel. So the way to think of that, right? So remember, when it comes time to blend these two things together, the blending is done in this case on the RGB pixel. So what it does is it takes the RGB pixel from the top layer and the bottom layer, it takes these two values here, it adds the two together and divides it by 2. So you A plus B over 2. So if the red channel in both is fully on, then the red channel in the output's going to be fully on. But if this one's fully on and this one's fully off, then obviously you're going to get 50% brightness on the green channel and the blue channel. And so that's what this is doing, right? Where both of them are where both are blue, you get the blue showing through. Where both are red, the red shows through quite nicely. So you can see, you can almost see that on the diagonal here. But where you get different mixes, etc., you get different amounts of the color showing through. What have I done? Okay. Let's bottom top. Okay, so bottom top, oh, it would help if I was choosing the right effect. All right. Okay. All right. Let's do this with the mouse for a second. All right, so let's set this to bottom and top. And what this is doing is splitting the buffer in type. So it's like you did a top sub-buffer on the top one and a bottom sub-buffer on the bottom one, and that's the result that you ended up with. You know, the top layer gets rendered at the top of the model, the bottom layer gets rendered at the bottom. The left-right does exactly what you would then expect it to do, which is it basically splits the buffer vertically. It renders the top layer on the left and the bottom layer on the right. Additive. So additive is very similar to what we just talked about here with the average, except when the layers get added together, if the red and the red are on, right, you get 255 plus 255, which is it's just shy of 512, but it doesn't do the divide by 2. And so what this has a tendency to do, if this was a 127 and this was a 127, then instead of being at 50%, this is going to be at 100%. And so what happens is the pixels all have a tendency to drift towards the white band, because as each channel adds up, because you're not dividing it by 2, everything gets pretty much close to fully turned on. And so you get lots of whiteness going on when you use additive. And when you use subtractive, you tend to get a lot more black, because in this case, what it does is it subtracts the channels out. So if this is 255 and this is 255, this becomes 0. If this is 127 and 127, this becomes 0. If this is 200 and this is 100, well, this becomes 100. So everything drifts towards the black side, and so you'll get a lot more black showing up. And if you use something more elaborate, like, I don't know, a butterfly, etc., all the colors would become quite muted if you're using subtractive. The maximum will also tend to drift towards white. In this case, maybe I should, 10, 10, actually make it 0, 10, 127, 200, and 255. 0, 10, 127, 200, 255. Okay, so in the case of this, we said maximum. What it's doing is it's taking the maximum of the two values. So this is going to be 255, 200, 127, 200, and 255. So, and it's doing it at the channel level. So each color is being maximized. And so again, this is going to drift its way towards white, because it's always taking the bigger of the two values across the two effects. And always at that channel level. And the minimum, of course, is going to do the reverse. It's going to tend towards black as well, because in that case, it's going to take the minimum. So 0, 10, 127, 10, and 0 is how it does that blending together. So yeah, it's a fairly simple mathematical formula. It's generally applied at either the node or the channel level. Most of them, all the bottom ones here are generally, these additive, subtractive, etc., are typically done at the channel level, whereas a lot of these top ones are done at the node level, at least conceptually when you think about it. So obviously it lets you go and create a whole bunch of interesting effects. I'm not going to go through that. There are oodles of videos out there where people talk about how to use these things to go and create various effects. I wanted to do more of a technical discussion of exactly what's going on behind each of these. So as I said, right, so every effect renders individually. So we prepare a buffer, we rotate it or whatever else, the effect draws inside the buffer, and then same up here with the next layer, we prepare a buffer, it renders inside it, and then at the very end, we go through and we take each pixel and we apply that blending style to generate a new buffer that contains all of that data blended together. Now, it all gets very complicated when you start to add in the canvas mode. And the reason it gets interesting is I talked about the fact that, you know, each layer is basically rendering on its own, and the blending then occurs at the end. The difference with canvas mode is, let's imagine that this one up here was a canvas mode layer. So instead of, you know, the buffer starting out black and then getting filled in, and at the end everything getting merged together, because this is a canvas mode, what actually happens is all of these effects get rendered, all the blending gets done, and then this buffer, when it's given to the effect up here, is actually already pre-filled with all of the data from the layers underneath. And then the effect gets rendered on top of it. which obviously generates a very different set of results, and it also allows the effect to manipulate the data from the underlying layers. Generally speaking, effects cannot see the data from other layers and therefore can't do anything and do everything totally independently of the other layers. But when you use canvas mode, all of this work down here has to be done first in order to give this effect that pre-rendered layer. Not only that, but once you've got canvas mode selected, you can actually go and choose the layers that get included. So in this case here, what I could do is I could say, you know what, when you present the layer to the canvas mode effect up here, instead of bringing this layer in, actually I just want you to bring that layer there and totally bypass that layer. And you can see that if you insert another layer below here and we throw a fire effect down or something, and if I come back up here to layers, you can see that there's a layer 1 and a 3, and so I can choose to leave layer 2 out. Now in this case it's not going to do anything interesting because of the effects that I've chosen, but that's conceptually what you can do. You can bypass a layer, and now when this effect renders, it's got access to the data from this underlying layer. You can then of course put another canvas effect in up here, and you can say actually now I want to bring up this effect layer, and then you can put another one at the top and so forth. And so you can end up with these very complicated blending capabilities across the multiple layers and generate some very, very interesting effects. But it will do your head in trying to work out exactly what's happening with all of these layer settings, etc. Generally speaking, people turn that off. There's only a couple of effects up here that really need it. If you're using the warp effect, if you're using the kaleidoscope effect, and some of the shaders also like to have the canvas mode turned on so that they can manipulate the data from some underlying effects. The only time I would use this layers button and select layers if you're trying to create a very intricate effect, blending images or something together in very interesting ways. Sometimes the only way to achieve that is using the layers, but this is not used very often. It's right at the extreme end of advanced. It also slows things down. And the reason it slows things down is because the canvas mode requires all of these underlying layers to be generated, well then all of this work has to be done in advance in order to let this thing render. And so that does have a bit of an impact on performance. Which one? The color black, the only color that is affected. I'm not sure what the context of that question was.
I think it was in mask 1 and 2. I think that's what they were talking about.
Yeah, so when you're doing masking, black is specially treated, right? So either it allows stuff through or it doesn't allow stuff through. And the unmasked versus the true unmasked, yeah, black's the color that's always made white for some reason using the unmasked. And to be honest, when I first implemented the unmasked or the true unmasked, I actually deleted the unmasked, but it broke some people's sequences, so I added it back in, and basically this is a bit of a slap in the face for this thing, which is pretty poorly implemented. So that's that one. Canvas mode combines layers effects regardless of the layers have black in them for previous layer to bleed through. No, the canvas mode respects all of the rules of blending. It doesn't override them. The only thing that canvas mode does is it presents a buffer. So when the buffer arrives for the effect to render, instead of, he says drawing in the wrong place. So as I said, so normally when an effect starts off and gets its render buffer, it is black to start with. And so when the effect starts to render into the buffer, it fills in, so the fire effect will draw the fire down here or whatever else. Now some effects draw black in the areas that are black and some effects don't. It depends on the effect. In the case of the bars effect, it draws the black. The black is a chosen color, so it draws it. It doesn't say, oh, that's black, I won't draw there. And so obviously then when you've got a canvas mode effect, instead of being presented with a black buffer, it's actually presented with a buffer that's already got a whole bunch of color in it. And so when the effect renders onto that buffer, if the effect renders black, it will overwrite whatever was there. Now, if the effect doesn't render in black, but just doesn't draw in those cells at all, well, then it won't overwrite what was previously in it from the underlying layer, and so it behaves slightly differently. So without looking at each individual effect and asking how does this effect handle blackness, it's impossible for me to say which ones are going to override or not override in canvas mode. Does that make sense? From memory, some of them are quite interesting. When you throw the video effect down, for instance, it actually gives you the ability to control whether black inside the video is rendered. And so you can actually get some quite interesting effects by playing with this transparent black option down here. And you can actually set the sensitivity of what's considered black, because obviously in videos, blacks are rarely truly black. They're close to black, but there's a small amount of color in there. And so you can play with the slider here to drive up, either drive down or drive up the level of sensitivity to what is black, and therefore what doesn't render, and therefore what will allow things to come through.
Keith, I have a question. I'm not sure quite how to ask it. If you have a layer by itself with a few props in it, and that layer also exists in a group, how do blending modes apply to that if you have effects on both the group and the single layer?
Right, okay, and actually that goes to Cranzy's question as well. So, delete everything. Okay, so there's an important option that for most people is going to be off by default. But when you create a sequence, you have this option here to allow blending between models. Normally what would happen is that people have, and you don't hear this as much anymore, but it's still true. So normally what happens is when you've got all your models listed, then we start at the top of the list and we render down. And this is in the master view, right? This is how we render. We start at the top, we do these models and we render down. Obviously, when you get to the individual models and you've got multiple layers, we start at the bottom and we render up. It's a little weird, but not totally weird. Where you have a model down here, and you might have a group up here which contains that model, obviously you can have an effect here and an effect here that are affecting exactly the same pixels. Now, if you don't have on layer blending between models, then whatever happens down here wins. This guy's the victor. And anything that happens up here is basically overwritten by what happens down here. However, if you turn on blending between models, then let's imagine, I don't know, let's imagine we have two layers of effects here. Let's call them, I don't know, let's call them A and B. And let's imagine we have two layers of effects up here, and let's call them gamma and pi. Okay, so how will this render out? Well, the answer is, it's going to render, and I'm going to do them left to right. So it's going to render gamma first, then it's going to render pi, then it's going to render A, and then it's going to render B. And it's going to do the blending between them all to produce the result. That's when you have layer blending between models. When you don't have layer blending between models, what it's going to do is it's going to render gamma. It's going to render omega. It's then going to throw the result away because it's going to overwrite it with A blended together with B, and that's going to be the result. And so this result here is never going to make it through to the final result because there is no blending allowed between these two. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect sense. So is that kind of an additional reason why groups are usually placed above models?
That's exactly why groups are generally placed above models, because most people, when they drop an effect onto a model and they also have an effect on the group, they're looking to see the model override the group. And so that's why you would do this. It's an interesting reason why you might want to create what we call shadow models, which is the same model multiple times in your layout mapped to the same channels, because that allows you to then have these things in different orders in the same sequence. I rarely see people bother to do it, but if you wanted some situations where the model was under the group sometimes, but then you also wanted the model above the group sometimes, one way to achieve that would be to create a duplicate of the model mapped to the same channels and then sequence it sometimes on this model and sometimes on this model, and it would then behave differently.
One more follow-up question on that. If you have a layer blending set on the group level, does that at all affect the model level? Like
So what affects how they merge together is the layer blending setting on this model here. Because remember, as we went through them, right, what controls how these two blend together is the blend style here. What controls how these two blend together is the blend style here. What controls how these two blend together is the blend style here. What does this blend style do? Well, it controls its blending together with this imaginary black layer. Right, because that's what it does. And so you remember when I set this to effect 2? Well, it let the effect 2 show through, which was black. Kinda. Right, and so in this case here, because there is no blending allowed here, the blend style here is actually blending to this imaginary black layer, which doesn't really exist. So it doesn't always do interesting things. In fact, I wonder what would happen if I put an average on a bottom layer. Not sure what will happen there. Oh, this damn pen causes me grief. So if I put in that and I set that to average, does it go half brightness? Okay, so you can see in this case, it's not going average brightness at all. That imaginary black layer is not actually impacting the average at all. Whereas, however, if I set the effect 2, it obviously shows blackness because it's hidden that effect. Subtractive. So interesting, subtractive has, because it's subtracting the colored bars away from the black layer, a subtractive is showing through the black. But if I showed the minimum of the two, yep, it's using the imaginary back layer. If I show the maximum, obviously the effect starts to show through again. If I do additive, of course, it's not going to do anything interesting. What's interesting is the average doesn't dim it down, which is interesting. I'm not sure that's entirely consistent, but it is what it is.
Yeah, Keith, there's another one in chat. So it always uses master view. So if I sort it for different view, I have to make a different master view first.
So render order is governed by this master view. You can have as many different views as you like. Commonly, you would do that to, particularly if you've got a big display, you want to see only a handful of models. You want to sequence your singing faces, so you'd create a view with just your singing faces in it, or you might put your tree and your matrix into a view so that you can just sequence on those, because that's how lots of people like to sequence. However, when it comes time to render, there is only one order that controls how you render, and that is your master view. So to change your master view, just go into Edit Display Elements. Bring that back up here. Oops, that was not what I intended. You've got your master view up here, and so if I reorder things in here, this will reorder things in your master view, but you can add a new view up here if you want. You can also take one of your other views and make that a master view, but be really, really careful when you do that, because only the models that exist in the master view can be sequenced. You can't have
You can choose not to display them. That's what these eyeballs here do. You can say, look, I don't want to see them when I'm sequencing, so my spinner, arches, and matrix now have all disappeared here, but they're still inside the sequence. And they will still render in that master view order, right? That is the order in which the models will render. And you can't have two render orders. You can't say, well, look, in this part of the sequence, I want to have it in this render order. In that part of the sequence, I want to have it in that render order. You can't do that. What you can do, however, is you can say, in this sequence, I want it to render in this order. But in this other sequence, I want it to render in totally different order. Because the master view is actually part of the sequence, not part of your display. So it is entirely customizable on a per sequence basis. All right, well, thank you guys. It was very different than running a beginner seminar. I realized that it got very technical, but that's the nature of buffers and layers. Buffers and layers are really the secret to being able to generate an effect that you can imagine in your head rather than playing with the tools and just coming up with an effect. It's only once you start to understand the way the buffers are created and the way the blend styles work to bring everything together that you can start to truly generate the effects that you would like to see rather than the effects that you just stumbled across or found or you're buying from your vendors, etc.